A few weeks ago, I made a video analysing the list of 142 race laws as compiled by Martin van Staden of the South African Institute of Race Relations, or IRR. This list is frequently cited by those who claim that white people are being unfairly targeted or discriminated against in South Africa. And my goal with that video was to really investigate whether the laws on that list are genuinely race laws and whether they specifically target white people, as is so often claimed. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend watching that video for the full context and my full analysis and breakdown of all 140 plus of these laws. But in summary, I had some concerns with how some of these laws were classified and why some of them were included on the list. Ultimately, I came to the conclusion that even being quite generous with what is considered a race law and what makes the cut for the list, that I did not believe that there were 142 race laws in South Africa, definitely not 142 laws that discriminate against white people, and I had some concerns with the types of laws that were being included and classed as a race law on this list. For example, laws that made minimal reference to representativity and transformation in just one section of the law were being counted as race laws. Anyway, following that video, I promoted it on Twitter, on X, and I shared some additional thoughts and posed some questions directly to Martin van Staden himself. Recently, Martin responded to some of my concerns and questions in an article on his blog or website. I will link that in the description below. And essentially, he answered 13 questions, some from me, some from others from different sources, and he provided explanations for some of the concerns and critiques that I had brought up directly to him. So since this is an ongoing topic of discussion, shall we say, I felt it was important to revisit it here on my channel and respond to his responses, essentially. Jumping straight in, one of the central questions in this entire debate is what actually counts as a race law? What defines a race law? And Martin and the IRR have their own definition that they use on their website, and he clarifies this in his article, that the definition that he and the IRR are using is what he says is a descriptive definition, not a normative definition, stating if the law keeps or makes a person's race or skin color legally relevant or allows a minister, official, or body to keep or make it relevant, it is a race law. Martin is very deliberate in the framing of the index as entirely objective, framing it as descriptive, not normative, not influenced by personal opinions on whether or not the laws are good or bad. He insists that despite his own personal perspective and beliefs on the topic, that the list is purely factual and unbiased, writing, the index, the table, the dataset, does not explicitly or implicitly pass judgment on whether a given law is good, bad, beneficial, detrimental, severe, or innocuous. The only task it has is to quantify the extent of race as a legislated phenomenon in South Africa. However, even Martin acknowledges that this idea of complete neutrality is impossible. He refers to edge cases, stating that the Appropriation Act of 2024 makes no explicit reference to race, but in time we may see that its public interest criterion is racially enforced, like how previously disadvantaged or disadvantaged by unfair discrimination from other laws are. Is this then a race law? That question has not been decisively answered yet, but at some juncture a decision will need to be made. This admission to me is crucial because it undermines the idea that the index is a purely objective endeavor. It reveals that some level of judgment will always be involved in determining which laws are included and which laws are not. Looking more closely at this example, the example of the Expropriation Act, which doesn't explicitly mention race, but Martin believes could one day be included on the list, we can identify an important question. Is the mere mention of race in a law sufficient to classify it as a race law, or should its actual impact be considered? Because consider the inverse of the Expropriation Act example. If a law allows for racial considerations, but it does not actually result in direct racial discrimination in practice, should it be considered and included on the list? This ties into another question that I asked, whether it's justified to consider an entire law a race law due to just one section calling for representativity or mentioning historical disadvantage. In answering this specific question, Martin again defers to the idea that the index must be objective and emphasizes his preference for a binary system of classifying these laws, stating that to exclude laws from being recorded in an index of race law only on the basis that the racial provision represents a small part of the law would make any recording of race in law impossible. As with other considerations, I need to limit my own discretion in deciding whether a single reference to race is a big or small feature of a given act. Now, I understand why a binary system makes classification easier. However, this approach also makes the index less useful. For instance, under this system, the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act, or BBBEE, is an explicitly racial policy, and it is treated the same as the Cooperatives Bank Act, an act which merely states that when making the appointments, the minister must take into consideration the need for transparency and representativity within the broader demographics of the South African population. This is important because not only is there a difference between a passing reference to race or representation and a substantive legal provision that actively shapes policy, but people will likely also have different perceptions of these two different types of law. Most people, when they hear the term race law, are not thinking of a law that is mostly unrelated to race but contains one passing reference to representativity. Therefore, if the index is choosing to follow this binary system of classification, I am going to question whether the label of race law, as the IRR has chosen to use, is fair and accurate. But, of course, calling the index the list of laws that make any reference to race in some way wouldn't be as catchy or inflammatory a title now, would it? Another point of mine that Martin addressed is why details of the relevant sections of these laws are not included in the index itself yet. I raised this question directly to Martin, noting that the index has been up for multiple years now at this point, and these sections have not yet been added into the index itself. Martin responded by claiming that this is an issue of capacity. He said that analyzing the provisions of these laws is a very tedious task, and that as a part-time endeavor, one pair of hands can only do so much. He also mentioned that anyone can request an updated copy of the law from the government at any time. And this is true. The laws are online. They are accessible. I was able to access these laws when doing my initial research for my original video itself. And I can also absolutely understand that capacity is a legitimate concern. Delving into the specifics of these laws, as I know myself from the research that I have done, is a time-consuming process. But here's the thing. When the IRR publishes an index that is presenting itself as a comprehensive and authoritative resource on race laws in South Africa, it then becomes a tool for public discourse. It is being used by people, politicians, media, and individuals who are making claims based specifically on this number of 142. And often the claims they are making is that these laws are specifically discriminating against white people, white South Africans. This is where I see an issue. Martin says that anyone can go and disprove the index at the drop of a hat. But the reality is, as Martin himself has acknowledged, this is a time-consuming process, and not everyone is going to have the time, the resources, or the expertise to go through these laws in detail as I have. The lack of transparency in the index itself about the specific provisions means that those of us trying to debunk the index or engage in a more nuanced discussion are left at a disadvantage. Even if Martin does not have the capacity or ability to provide extracts from the laws, at least pointing to the relevant sections would allow people to see what the actual claims being made are. What are the actual perceived issues with any given act? Without this sort of transparency, it becomes far too easy for people to just take the numbers that the IRR and Martin are providing at face value without the context of how these laws are being applied or used, or how they've evolved since their inception. So while yes, the index might be mostly accurate in terms of what it includes, but without transparency about those specific provisions of each law, people are left to fill in the gaps themselves. And most people are not going to take the time to do the research themselves. So what we've seen is that this is often going to lead to misrepresentation and misuse, with people weaponizing the number specifically of 142 to promote a narrative that does not actually reflect the legal situation and legal landscape in South Africa as it stands. So while yes, it may be time consuming and there may be an issue of capacity, I believe Martin and the IRR have an obligation to provide this information. By failing to do so, they are not just leaving a gap in understanding, but they are actually facilitating the spread of misinformation, whether intentionally or not. It's not about accusing them of hiding anything. Yes, the information is out there and publicly available in some sense, but at the end of the day, if you are presenting something as factual and definitive, you have an obligation to make sure that it's not only accurate, but also transparent, especially when it is being used to shape public opinion and fuel social division on a topic with such importance as race in South Africa. If Martin does not have the capacity for that yet, then perhaps the index should not have been released yet. In my original video, I flagged 3 laws where I could not find any reference to race at all. Because Martin's index labels these as racial laws, meaning by the index's own definition that they contained racial provisions from their inception, I only checked the main acts. And after scouring the main acts of these 3 pieces of legislation, I could not find any actual substantive mention of race, diversity, anything of the sort in these acts. The index has a separate label for laws that have become racial through amendments, referring to these as racialized laws. So based on that, I did not search the later amendments of these acts, and therefore I assumed that these acts were included due to keyword searches that weren't properly verified. For example, one of these laws or acts references plant diversity, and I assumed the word diversity had simply been flagged and the law was included in the index for that reason. However, Martin has now come out and clarified that while keyword searches are used in the creation of the index, that all of these keyword searches are verified and the actual sections are read for context. And he has admitted that these 3 laws were a mistake in how they were classified or labeled. He clarified that in all 3 of these cases, the racial provisions were added later through amendments and that the racial provisions did not exist in the original acts themselves. He also has stated that this labeling will be corrected in the next update of the index. Now, while this resolves that one specific error, it does raise another question of how many other laws on the list might be mislabeled. If mistakes like this have already slipped through, how rigorous is the overall methodology of the list? In fairness, Martin has acknowledged a number of times that the index is a work in progress. He has asked for feedback and corrections. However, this is now an incomplete work that has been shown to contain errors, but is being used by many people and organizations, some of whom are quite prominent, to make very declarative claims about race laws in South Africa. And that brings us back to the question of the previous point of transparency and accuracy. And I think only further emphasizes why such transparency that I mentioned in the previous section is actually necessary. Of course, everyone can make mistakes, and Martin has shared that this is essentially a one-man endeavor, but it is an endeavor that is being presented as authoritative, as credible, and is being used to shape political discourse in South Africa. Maybe the fact-checking shouldn't be left up to random people online like myself, and there should have been more verification in the actual creation of the index itself before it started being touted by various people and organizations as a definitive answer to the question of race laws in South Africa. And of course, the mislabeling of these 3 laws as racial rather than racialized as they are is not, in the grand scheme of things, a huge issue and really doesn't make that much substantive difference to the index itself. But it is still a mistake. It is still an error that's occurred, and I definitely think that the IRR, Martin, and the index are worth scrutiny, especially considering how it's being used. And even though this is just one small mistake, it is indicative that mistakes are possible and have been present in this index before. Now, another update, another mistake that has been corrected since my video is that the homepage of the Race Law Index now actually includes a footnote acknowledging that 9 of the 142 laws that they claim are operative race laws in South Africa are deracialized. Martin argues this information has always been available on the website if you examined the detailed index, if you went to look at the index itself. But I still believe that if the headline number is 142 operative race laws in South Africa, then no reasonable person would look at 142 operative race laws in South Africa and assume that it also includes a number of laws that no longer contain racial provisions. Even with the footnote, I believe including them in the count of operative race laws is incredibly misleading, as they are, by Martin's own definition of what a race law is, no longer race laws. So why are they included in that count of 142? And this is a deliberate choice that Martin is making. He does not have to highlight 142 as the number. he could just as easily emphasize the number of laws that actually still contain racial provisions. He could exclude this number of 9 from the 142 easily. He could choose to present whatever number, whatever combination, whatever idea of race laws that he wants to on his own webpage. But he still chooses to highlight the number 142, knowing that it contains 9 laws that are deracialized, that no longer contain racial provisions. I find that, again, wildly misleading to anyone that is just seeing that number of 142 in isolation, which is a lot of people. Not many people are going to take the time to actually go into the actual index itself and look at all these different laws and break them down in the way that I have. It's why I made the video, because not many people have the time to do that. So again, the idea that the footnote has been added now is somewhat helpful, but people online are still sharing that number of 142. People are still using that number of 142, and no one sharing that number of 142 is including the footnote. The footnote is a little bit late now, considering that the number of 142 has grown a life of its own, essentially. On a similar note, in my original research and my original video, I identified 14 laws that I have kind of broadly classed as being functionally obsolete, meaning that they are, yes, still technically laws in South Africa, but they are really no longer actively enforced or really relevant at all in a modern South African context. A lot of these laws were from pre-1994, and any racial provisions that they contained were specifically racial provisions that were benefiting white people, discriminating against people of color in this country, non-white people in this country, and are really not relevant in the South African legal landscape today any longer. Martin's answer for why these laws are included is as follows. It is important for me to limit my own discretion as far as I possibly and reasonably can, though I can never exclude it entirely. This includes disallowing myself to decide which laws are and are not functionally obsolete. For me to deem a certain racial provision unenforceable because I do not think it's constitutionally compliant would mean that I could also deem the Employment Equity Act, BBBEE Act, and many others to be unenforceable because I regard them, as I do, to be unconstitutional. The convention has been, and this has been observed in the supermajority of cases by all South Africa's legislatures since 1910, for Parliament to explicitly repeal those laws it no longer desires to see on the books. I have deferred to this convention. But here's my problem with that argument and reasoning. If a law no longer has any effect, then its inclusion on a list that is specifically being used to quantify racial legislation in South Africa today is misleading. The entire premise of the index is to illustrate the extent of race as a legislated phenomenon. But if a portion of these laws are not actually functioning as race laws in practice, what is this number actually telling us? It makes the index, or more specifically the number of 142 that includes this 14, meaningless. Ultimately, Martin wants this index to be objective. He wants to take a black and white approach. If a law mentions race at all, then it's a race law, full stop. But I would argue that relevance is really important to be considered. Otherwise, the index is not a meaningful analysis of race or racial legislation in South African law today at all. It is not even a meaningful quantification of race in South African law today, but rather it's just a raw dump of the data that fails to actually reflect the reality of the situation in South Africa. And again, this brings us back to the idea of how this index is used. Martin might claim that it's just a neutral tool, but this neutral tool is routinely being used to suggest that there are 142 actively enforced racially discriminatory laws in South Africa, and that these laws are particularly discriminating against white people. But because of the inclusion of these 14 functionally obsolete laws, that is not an accurate interpretation of this list at all. Because not all of the laws are then active, not all of them are actually being enforced, and definitely not all of them are discriminatory against white people, considering that many of these laws, these 14, are from pre-1994 and are actually there to preserve the status of white people as above everyone else in South Africa, and are actually discriminatory towards non-white people in South Africa if they were to be enforced. But even though the suggestion that there are 142 active discriminatory race laws against white people in South Africa is not accurate based on the IRR Martin's list, he does not seem to particularly be interested in correcting that misinterpretation or misconception in any way. Which brings us to the final question of mine that Martin answered. I asked him why the IRR does not push back against this misrepresentation of the list as 142 laws that discriminate against white people. And his response was essentially that the IRR already opposes all race laws and has done so since 1929. But that's not really the question that I asked. Ultimately, my issue here is not that the list exists. My issue is how that number of 142 is being framed and weaponized. The IRR is choosing to highlight this number of 142, despite knowing how it is used and how misleading it is when it is used in that context. Martin's full response was, the IRR has spoken out against race laws since 1929. It has done this because of an opposition to race law per se, regardless of who it ostensibly favors or disadvantages. By constructing the index from the beginning, including race laws from before 1994, the IRR and I have spoken out. If our interest was only in propagandizing the continued racialism evident in the post-1994 establishment, the index could very well have only recorded the race laws of this constitutional dispensation, 1994 to present. But the decision was consciously made to look at race law as a historic and enduring South African phenomenon. Nonetheless, and saying this should not be contentious, it should be obvious that virtually all of the race laws that are not functionally obsolete today and are in operation are enforced to operate primarily against white individuals. Whether this is severe or innocuous or truly harmful or unintentionally beneficial to whites is not the question. The only question is whether the law, which is supposed to be the common heritage of all bound by it, discriminates against or in favor of some legal subjects. Of course, Rawson will want to debate me on this, and that is fine, but this is precisely why the index of race law does not try to wade into the normative question of whether this law or that law actually benefits or harms anyone. The discourse is fraught as it is and need not be complicated even further. The index only looks at whether a law is a race law and leaves it as that. Other researchers can and are encouraged to utilize the index as a starting point in their own journeys of inquiring into specific aspects of race law that interest them. Again, I don't really think that answers the question I was asking. Yes, the IRR may have spoken out against race laws in general, but my concern is not whether they speak out against race laws, it's why they do not speak out when their list is misused. This 142 figure is what gets highlighted, and this number is distorted when it's used to promote an oversimplified narrative about discrimination against white people. The IRR and Martin can see this happening, but they choose not to address it. That is where the issue lies. Martin claims that the index does not try to engage with whether a law actually benefits or harms anyone because of the complexity of the discourse. And I can understand a desire to avoid further complication, but that is actually why nuance is so essential in these conversations. The issue of race laws in South Africa is fraught with complexity already. And oversimplification, like with what the race index is doing, only exacerbates the confusion and the division that already exists. Rather than avoiding the issue, more nuance is actually needed to foster an accurate understanding of the legal landscape regarding race in South Africa. Now, the IRR, Martin's index, could, in theory, be a neutral starting point for further research. But by not issuing any corrections when that number of 142 is misinterpreted and misused, and by framing the index in the way that they have chosen to, the IRR is leaving it wide open for exploitation and misunderstanding. So while the index itself might not try to answer whether the laws benefit or harm any group, the way it is framed, the way it is presented, inevitably is going to impact how it's used in political discourse. And if a data set that is supposed to be neutral is consistently being misinterpreted in a way that aligns with a particular ideological stance, should the organization responsible for this data set, the organization, the person that is claiming that this data set is a neutral tool, should they not be taking steps to correct that misunderstanding? To conclude, Martin and the IRR want to present this index as a neutral and objective list. But the choices Martin has made, what is included, what is emphasized, how it is framed, show a clear bias. Martin has mentioned in his article that it is obvious that the majority of race laws operate primarily against white individuals. And that statement, I believe, is key because it reveals the framework from which Martin was operating when compiling this index. While he may frame and try to present the index as neutral, The choices that he made, from which laws were included to how the number of 142 is emphasized, suggest that there is bias in how this data is being presented. In his response article, Martin has admitted his perspective on this issue. I don't think it's one that he was particularly trying to hide before anyway, but there is a clear perspective that he has on this issue. He believes, and he believes that it's obvious, that there are race laws in South Africa that are targeting and discriminating against white people. I would respect him far more if he just made an index, a list that supported that claim, that provided evidence for that claim. But there is benefit, there is credibility that comes from pretending to be neutral. And even though Martin himself has admitted in this response that true neutrality is actually impossible, he is still trying to present this index as a neutral piece of work when I believe it is very, very clearly not. By presenting their work as an objective index of race laws, they are trying to maintain an illusion of neutrality, while benefiting from the fact that others are then using that work to promote a specific narrative. And this lack of accountability is what I believe is truly the most problematic thing about the Race Laws Index. Saying that there are 142 operative race laws in South Africa, I believe is incredibly misleading for the reasons that I've mentioned both in this video and in my previous video. And why I believe the index and the use of the number of 142 should be called into question whenever it is used.